All right, so welcome to the Digital Novelist Podcast. I'm Keith Hayden, and I'm so excited to have a phenomenal guest. And I don't know if you know this, but you're actually my first guest.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. Well, I feel honored.
Yeah, no, I'm honored. The honor is mine. This is Alan Grimes. I'm here with Alan Grimes, a supernatural horror writer who actually shares a lot in common with me because he's also has a law enforcement background. And Alan has just released his latest novel, Where the Lantern Swings?
When the lantern
When the
swings.
Lantern Swings. Got it. When the Lantern Swings just came out this summer, 2024, and I got to say I read the first two chapters and I just saw his style, his experience as a fiction writer, and of course his experience as a law enforcement officer. So, welcome to the Digital Novelist Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so like I said before we started recording, my style is just more it's more like just like a conversation. So I wrote down a bunch of questions, mostly out of my curiosity, but we'll just tangents. I love tangents.
There you
So
go. So do I.
the first thing I wanted to ask is when you were in law enforcement, that's kind of where you started with this. What made you decide to keep writing? Because what happens a lot, as you know, the job just kind of overshadows everything. And I know that's the way it was when I was in law enforcement in the military. It was like I knew I wanted to write, but there was rarely any time to write. So how did you balance that, and what made you eventually make the switch to go back? Okay, I'm going to do this full time.
Well, the first thing is that I always considered myself a writer. I never considered myself to be anything else. So I was a writer who did other things. I was a writer who was a college student. I was a writer who was a cop. And then I was a writer who was an FBI agent. And finding the time to write, I look at it differently. I look at it is I have to find time to do other things because I have to write. I have a certain amount of time that I have to write, and then oh yes, I have to build the rest of my life around writing, and that's the way I always approach things. And of course, it's tough um, in the various jobs that you have. There were times I was involved in a case that was so heavy
Yeah.
it left little time for other things. But I still would find some time to write every. I'm going to write every day, no matter what. If I'm sick, if I'm having a bad time, if I'm involved in something else, maybe that writing period is only an hour that day, but I'm going to write every day, and that's my determination.
Wow. So it sounds like you took a very similar approach that I did. So when you got your writing intervals, what were you writing? Were you journaling? Were you doing working on stories, or what was your focus when you had your time when you were in?
I was primarily writing short stories in the sci-fi horror genre and getting them published in various magazines.
Nice. Okay, so you already had a foot in the door while you were still in. So you were kind of doing a double dip, so to speak.
It didn't seem that way at the time.
Yeah.
It seemed that, short story writing was, I mean, it was very frustrating because it took me so long to be published for each story because you go through 20, 30 rejections
Yeah.
before you finally get published. So it didn't seem at the time like I had my foot in the door. It only seems that way now
Yeah.
with when the lantern swings and it having some success. That okay, now you've got your foot in the door. Other than that, it feels like you're just trying to stay alive. You're just trying to do the craft and get your stories out there the best you can.
Yeah. So did you feel like when you were publishing those short stories, because this is something that I've avoided, I think we've taken kind of opposite routes. Like you've taken more of the traditional route with your fiction, and I've taken more of the newer route as far as internet focused and things like that. So did you find when you published those short stories, did it really get your foot in the door? Did it make a difference when you went to publishing your own fiction, or how did that look for you?
No, it made no difference at all, other than being able to put it on your jacket, on your bio.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody looked at it and said, "Oh, he's published, horror stories in, the one of the magazines is called Lords of Eternal Darkness," which is a very dark sounding name, but it was just a regular horror magazine.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, but I don't think anybody looks at that and says, "Oh, he's got all of this experience,"
Yeah.
uh, especially when it became tougher and tougher to get an agent
Mm.
and and then to eventually get traditionally published.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's what I figured. I figured it's very much like what I'm seeing with my side. It's a snowball effect to where, and a lot of it's less about the bona fides that you can put on the jacket and say you were in Lords of Darkness magazine. That's a cool name. That you were in this magazine in X and Y publication. It's more of like, at least this is what I find, and maybe you can attest to this, expand on this. Was it more of like a confidence thing to where I got published in this, so I can get published in that, and I did that, so then I can do my own thing? Is that what did that? Is that how it played out for you, or was it something different?
The confidence came after publishing, I think maybe my third story in a magazine. The first time I got published, it happened pretty easily and very quick. Actually,
Nice.
it was never rejected, and it was the story that I worked least on. And this is a true story. My wife, I was living in Akron, and my wife was working in Cleveland, and I wrote a short story called "There Are Gaps" into a tape recorder on the drive up to Cleveland.
Wow.
And I picked her up, came back, typed it, did a few revisions, and the first time I sent it was published.
Amazing.
So then I thought, hey, I'm a great writer, man. I got this thing published and right away. And then after that, my second story,
Mm.
I think, was rejected 27 times,
Wow.
which I think is my record before it was published.
Wow.
Um, but you just have to have that kind of persistence,
Yeah.
confidence in yourself, maybe a little bit of arrogance. I don't know.
Mm.
But yeah, but then I was starting to think, well, that was a fluke, and maybe I'm not that good of a writer. So, but
No, it's true, man. And as fiction writers, we psych ourselves out really a lot. That's one of those things that I think it's almost worse if you have the success up front, like you did with that first story. You're like, well, shit, I did this on one drive. This was a one shot, one take thing, and a little bit of work, and it got accepted. And what I'm finding now, and you probably could attest to this too, a lot of it's just reps. A lot of it is that volume first, because where I think a
yes,
lot of novelists, especially people that focus on fiction writing, they get caught up in the perfection of the first draft of the first. Well, this is my first book, so it's got to be hot out the gate. I'm trying to write Harry Potter right now, and it doesn't work that way typically. Most people you see, I mean, I forget how many times she got rejected with Harry Potter. It was a lot that she got turned
yes,
away, and they didn't believe in the book, so they ordered like 500 copies or some very small amount, and then it turned out to be a hit. So it's like these things don't start out as successes. There's nothing guaranteed. It's just more of you keep at the craft, and
mhm,
eventually
uh,
the
mhm,
right person
right,
sees.
yes, and that's so true. And you get better. Um, I met Dean Koontz at the Palm Springs Writers Conference.
Nice.
He said two things that struck me. He said that he wrote 10 books that he never got published
Wow.
before he started getting published. And then he also said that he wished that he hadn't published some books when he was younger and when he
Yeah.
wasn't as honed at his craft.
Yeah.
And I have that same experience because I have two self-published works, and I
Mm.
look back at them now and I was like, oh man, you could have done
Yeah.
that so much better.
It's rough.
So you almost wish that that wasn't out there because inevitably people will ask, "What else do you have?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Oh, okay, I've got two other novels." You can't tell them, "I don't really want you to go and look."
Right. Don't go look at that old stuff.
Yeah.
It's there if you
Uh,
really want it, but
yeah.
and I think we all have that. Like the longer you're in the game, because you do get better. And I had that with my first
Yeah.
novel. I published my first novel in 21, and just this year I went back and redid it because somebody wanted it in the store. And I was like, I had that same feeling like, oh shit, what if they go read it?
Yeah.
And it
Exactly.
wasn't bad, but it's just you can do better. Like 4 years later, you've been writing
Right.
fiction, and you're ready. Like, okay, I know I can do much better. Let me go back. So I did. I went back and I revised it, and I added some stuff. I took some stuff out, made some stuff more striking, and I think it's better for it. I paced it better because I didn't know anything about pacing, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's what a lot of people start out with. It's a passion project. It's just
Yes.
raw story and like I've got an idea and I've got to put it down. And you're not thinking technique, you're not thinking craft. You're just thinking this character, this scenario, this opening line maybe. It all starts with some type of seed and then it grows around there. But then
Yes.
when you zoom out, you're like, well, this is kind of
Yep. I'm there. And that's a good idea. I'm thinking about going back and rewriting my second novel
yeah.
because the premise is so good.
Yes.
Um, but I could have done a lot better. The first one, even though my writing was a lot more primitive, that's still okay. That would still hold up.
Yeah.
And people who read that going, "Oh yeah, this is good writing." But the second one, so yeah, I think I might go back and redo that one.
Yeah, well, I think we all have those, and it feels it can feel sometimes like a waste because you're like, well, I want to do something new, but then to go back and spend a couple of weeks, I don't know. It took me. I did my revision pretty fast, but it still took about I don't know 5 or 6 weeks, and
Hmm.
that's 5 or 6 weeks that I'm not doing the new thing,
Right.
and so it takes you away from that. I wanted to ask you about because you spent a lot longer in law enforcement than I did. So what was the most difficult part about transitioning from going full time FBI law enforcement, and then I think you did some time in local police, right? You were local PD for a
Yes.
while, and so what was that like when you decided to leave that behind and okay, I'm gonna go basically 180 and become a novelist?
Well, it wasn't difficult at all because, as I said, my mentality always was, I'm a writer and I'm doing these other things. And I used to tell my agents that on my squad, and I said, "You're not just an FBI agent. You have to have something else going."
Yes, love
And you
that.
probably know this in law enforcement, it happens so often that people retire and then you read about them and they're dead within a year.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
They
such.
gained like 40, 50 pounds
Yeah,
and start drinking because they identify themselves with being that one thing and they
yeah,
don't have anything else going. For that, they just kind of give up on life.
yeah.
That's why they force us to retire at an early age, at 57.
Wow.
Um, so I always kind of waiting to retire so that then I could have even more time to devote to writing. It wasn't difficult at all. It was like, okay, now we can really do this. So
Great. Yeah. I wish I could say my transition was smoother. It wasn't. I struggled for a while because I went into a completely different direction. My After I got out of the military, I was trying to become a Spanish court interpreter, and I didn't know Spanish.
oh, okay,
And I would tell people, and they would be like, "So, Cap," and I was an agent with. It was, yeah, I told you where I was with the
right.
Air Force Office of Special Investigation. So they'd be like, "Oh, so what are you gonna do?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, Spanish court interpreter." And they'd be like, "Good luck." They just didn't know what to
Habla
say.
español?
Yes, they did not know what to say, and I
Uh,
didn't really know what to say either. But I mean, I was really passionate about learning languages. For me, learning languages was my first passion, and then it was writing next because I journaled for my entire time throughout the military. I journaled for about 14 years straight. I actually have them up here. They're all a bunch of old spirals. And that was my writing practice while I was still
Oh,
in.
that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I really honed, I got my confidence up that hey, I can actually write stories, I can write something
Mhm.
interesting, and I just did a lot of experimentation there. But yeah, I after I that plan went bust. It took about a year and a half before I was like, okay, this isn't going to work. And so I went to teaching, and I went back to school and got my teaching credential, and I liked teaching, but then we moved, and then I couldn't do it
Mm.
anymore. So then it was like, okay, I had written these books, and I was like, okay, let me try and make a go at this. But yeah, I wasn't as focused as you were. It sounds like you knew you were always okay, fiction, short stories, then eventually, of course, you're gonna write novels or whatever length
Right.
that you want. And I like that. But for a lot of people, it's not so easy. I mean, and we're talking law enforcement, but it doesn't matter if you're coming from any profession, any like salaried profession, and then you're like, I'm gonna go write fiction. Do you
Right.
want to eat food? Do you like food? You don't like food. Do you like lights? Shit.
Yes,
Hopefully
my
you're
my
single. You don't have
friend
a family.
my friend is going through that. She was
Yeah.
in law enforcement, but we were in the same writers group when I was in Akron, and she just now retired.
Mm,
And she's saying, "Okay, I'm going to do this now." And I said, "Okay, I'm there for you. Let's talk. Let's critique each other's work.
yeah.
But that was very difficult for her because
Yeah.
she had been wanting for a long time just to be a full-time novelist, and she's a very good writer.
Mm,
Had some great ideas, but she, she just was always on the verge of making that transition, and then she would pull back, and she's like, "No, I'm not going to retire, and I'm going to go back to it." So yeah, so she
yeah.
very much struggled with that, but fortunately, I did not. I did have a huge setback because I had gotten an agent, and but then by the time I was ready to be a full-time novelist, he unfortunately passed away.
Oh,
And so I said, "Oh no, I have to try to get another agent," which is
yeah.
a nightmare in itself.
Yeah.
So, but he was pretty good, pretty well known. His name was Ray Powers,
Mm,
and he represented the guy who wrote the novel from which the movie Exit Wounds was made.
mm.
And he's actually appeared on screen himself in a few small roles.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, that's pretty cool. And I wanted to ask you about that process because I'm not very familiar. You're more couched in the traditional publishing world. So, especially for this audience who is tends to be more on the digital side. But what was that process like for you? Did you just do the query blast, bazooka blast, just keep going at it, or was it another way, or how did that go for you finding the agent?
Did the query route at first
Mm.
and wasn't getting much success. So then I just started going to writers' conferences all over the
Mm.
place and meeting people in person.
Yeah.
And after a while, only go to the writers' conference for the purpose of meeting an agent.
There you
I
go.
wouldn't even go to any of the workshops. And I went to Houston, the Houston Writers Conference, and that's where I met Ray Powers.
Cool.
And I did my pitch, and he liked it, and he liked the background. Now, the background, we're talking about things that bona fides that helps you. The background does help. You tell people, "Hey, I've spent 26 years in law enforcement." Their
Okay.
ears perk up, and I'm sure that's what got me over the hump with Ray Powers,
Nice.
and so he was able to represent me. But then starting over again,
Yeah.
um, it was even tougher
Hmm.
because there's been a transition in the fiction field where it used to be hard to get published even after you had an agent.
Yeah.
But that was where the stumbling block was, is because no one would take a chance on a new writer.
Yeah.
Then um, by the time I started looking for an agent again, it had transitioned where it's extremely hard to get an agent now because every agent wants a slam dunk.
Yeah.
And how do they know what's going to be a slam dunk? Well, they don't. They have to take a chance.
Right.
They don't want to take a chance.
Of course.
Oh, when I started querying agents again, the rejections I was getting, they were all saying glowing things about my writing, but then they would reject me anyway. I
Yeah.
was like, well, if you like it, why won't you represent me?
Yeah.
Well, I just wasn't excited enough about it.
Yeah.
I have to
Yeah.
be excited. I was like, well, you don't have to marry it. You have, so,
Right.
uh, yeah, that was pretty frustrating.
I
I
bet.
would rather have them say, well, this is crap. I'm
Hmm.
not going to represent you, rather than, oh, this is great, but I'm still not going to represent you.
Right.
So, you know,
Yeah, and honestly, that second account is what I've seen online. Like the majority of authors that, there's this hashtag am querying. They will say like I'm doing query letters. I'm trying to get represented, and that is the story that I see over and over again of agents who are very cautious. Who you're exactly right. They want a slam dunk. They want to at least make their money back, and it's what they, and maybe you could attest to this because I've just noticed a trend. Maybe you've seen this, and I ask you about this. A trend of recent commercial fiction that is just in a very similar vein. Like, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't even go down the query route because I was like, my stuff's too weird. It's not. It doesn't fit neatly enough into a market to where you could say, okay, it's for this demographic. It's for this type of reader. I know it's not. I know I'm looking for a very sliver of a sliver of readers. And so have you found that with your fiction because yours is it is it's police procedural, but then there's elements of supernatural.
right.
So have you found that with your stuff?
Yes, very much so. They now demand that you give them comps, like whose
Yeah,
work is this like,
absolutely.
and you have to do it. You can't say, well, mine is unique, because if you say that, then they won't look at you,
No.
because again, they want something that they can put into this niche,
Mm-hmm.
so that they don't have to risk anything. And the problem with being risk averse is that you can never get that great novel if
Exactly.
you're risk averse, because every groundbreaking work has been something that's a little different.
Right.
Like the Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale.
Right. Exactly.
That's something that's broke boundaries, and the Harry Potter books.
Right.
That was something. That's probably why they were constantly rejecting her. It's like, well, wait a minute, what is this like? Well, it's like nothing else. And
Right.
then then you have a bunch of copycats from that,
Yeah.
and you got the Hunger Games, groundbreaking. Then you had a bunch of
Yeah.
dystopian world where children are being chased by some
Oh,
kind of government cabal. So yeah,
I'm so glad we're out of
uh,
that era. That was about 10 years
yes,
ago where those
yeah,
stories, they were all like preteen, teen stories, Hunger Games, Divergent.
yes,
I'd even throw Twilight in there. I know Twilight's supposed to be like fantasy and all this stuff, but I mean, still
yeah,
very much aimed at that audience. And that's, you're right,
yeah.
that was piggybacking off the success of
Oh yeah,
Harry Potter.
yeah,
And yeah,
and
they all started to read and look and sound the same after a while. But that is an
they all
interesting
want
point.
series now too.
Yeah,
That's another thing. You got to have a series. You can't just do a one-off book.
exactly. Yeah, and that shook me as a new author when I found out that hey, the only way to, not the only way, but one of the ways to ensure your success as a fiction writer is to write a series. And one book is hard. A whole damn series, some people don't have it in them. I mean, how are you approaching that? I think you said that um you're planning on writing at least a sequel to the next book, or you're already
Yes,
writing.
yes. I'm writing. Actually, I'm almost finished with the sequel,
Nice.
and the uh, in my mind, I had it as a three-story arc
Yeah.
where the character transitions from being uh, he's always thought of himself as a cop.
Right.
He's an investigator, but at some point, circumstances are going to force him to realize that. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think that was in here. Um, Circumstances force him to realize that this supernatural investigation, demon hunter, whatever he calls himself, is his calling. And so
Mm,
he's no longer going to consider himself a cop,
cool.
but he's going to accept his role. Okay, now I'm this, whatever this is. you call it. Um, and oh yeah, so that's going to be the arc of the story.
I like
I
that.
don't mind doing that with this because the type of story it is
Yeah.
um, makes that makes that very easy.
Yeah.
So, uh, but I don't want to be forced to do that
Right.
if it's not something that I already have in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's where the series gets difficult for someone like me. I mean, I wrote my first novel not really thinking of a series, and then at the very last minute, I was like, okay, maybe I'll keep it open for a sequel. And I am actually writing this as a series, but
Mm.
I think when you force it to become a series and it wasn't meant to be a series, and you're the author on that end, well, I didn't plan for this to be a series. I think that puts you in a spot creatively to where you're like, well, now you've got to do the Harry Potter because that's what she did. She basically tacked on. She wasn't really thinking that okay, this is going to be a 7 book series. That wasn't like that when she wrote the
Yes,
first one. So it was like it's kind of
right.
tacked on, and it worked out beautifully.
Yes,
But
yes,
it doesn't with every story. Every story doesn't need a
yes.
series.
Mhm.
So I wanted to ask you about let's do a technology question. So you know that a lot of people are using AI to write. AI has become a very huge just tool, like we've seen in the last 2 years, how commercial AI has really changed the game. I see it every day on social media. I'm not sure what your exposure has been to it, but how do you think that writing is going to change in the future with the advent of
I'm
this technology?
yeah. I think that with this tendency to serialize everything, that's going to prompt even more AI. At
Yeah.
the last writers conference I attended in Las Vegas, there was the publishers panel. Uh, they were describing a guy who turns out a book a month, and we were all wondering about what kind of quality
Mm.
can that be. And then it transitions to, is he using AI? And
Mm.
the panelists, the publishing house, basically their answer was, we don't care if he is using AI.
Of course not. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I just obviously that's not something that I want to see happen
Mm.
because a lot of people don't understand that AI is not creating anything.
Right.
It's just taking what others have done and putting it together
Right.
based on they what has worked in the past.
Right.
And so, that's not creation.
Mm.
And I think if we go too much down this rabbit hole, that it's not going to be good for those of us who are actually writing fiction. I won't even use AI to create a synopsis.
Mm.
One of the publishing houses actually told us to do that.
Mm.
It said to put your novel in there and then tell the AI to do your synopsis. No, if you can't do a synopsis, then you're not a writer.
Mm.
And that's it, in my opinion. I don't know.
Mm.
I mean, maybe others have a different opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I understand, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to ask you these questions because you have a foot in the traditional publishing world. So, how would you say they do think about AI in general? Like, what do you think is the sentiment negative, positive, or are they kind of dipping their toes, or is it because I only see I'm on X Twitter pretty much daily, and I only see boosters and haters. I see people that are like, AI is here, let the machine come. And then I see
Hmm.
the opposite end where it's like, if you use AI, you're trash, you're stealing artwork, and no AI. So, what is it, the sentiment? What do you think?
As far as the publishers go, the small to medium press publishers, they're very much okay with it. Like they said, they basically don't care if you use AI to create the book. They also, I got the impression from this panel, didn't care about the quality as long as it sells. This
Wow.
particular publishing house, and I'm not saying that this is widespread.
Yeah.
This particular publishing house
Interesting.
has developed an algorithm to find what they call whale readers.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with that term?
No, I have not heard this.
A whale reader is someone who just voraciously reads books, and
Hmm.
they will read an entire novel in a day,
Yeah.
and then they'll look for the next one.
Yep.
And somehow they figured out how to find these people, and so they're selling a lot of books,
Wow.
and they don't care at all about the quality. That's why. That's well, what if they use AI? They said, well, we don't care as long as we can sell this work. Now, I don't think that that's widespread yet, but I
Right.
think more likely the small to medium press publications would do that
Yeah.
rather than the big, the Random House and places like that. I don't think that they're that much into AI. And
Hmm.
my personal opinion is that it is plagiarism because
Hmm.
you're taking someone else's work, even though you're not, stealing the entire thing,
Right.
but you're taking other people's work and putting it together, into a story.
Hmm.
And so I'm not pleased that, it says that, you're trash if you use it, um, but do I like it? No.
Hmm. Yeah, I noticed that too, and I've definitely heard that the plagiarism side. And one of the reasons why I started this podcast is that I've spent an extensive amount of time not just testing AI when it comes to fiction writing, but just in writing in general. And one of the reasons why is because, and this is why I started the whole technology thing several years ago, even pre AI, is because I wanted to understand this technology. I wanted to, if it was going to take all the jobs and Skynet was coming down and the robots and all these things, then I was like, okay, I want to understand my overlords, that type of mentality. And
Hmm.
that's led me down this kind of rabbit hole of really deep diving into AI. And what I found is there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of lack of education because this is brand new technology. I mean, just 2 years ago, nobody
Right.
even knew that you could write entire books with AI. Nobody knew that you. I mean, no, our previous run-ins with it were like things like Google Translate or things like that, to where it would just come up with text. You have speech to text. They were very primitive, very robotic. But something, and I think a lot of people's problem with it, and I'll definitely agree with this, is it just feels too human. It feels too close to what you or I could do as a writer. And I
Hmm.
think they they just have pause with that it's like it's just too weird. And then the fact of, you throw in the traditional thinking of which a lot of people think of, this was trained off of other people's work, therefore it's not producing anything new. This feels like stealing. This feels like cheating. A lot of people, I've seen that sentiment online with it.
Yes.
And yeah, you're right. And I think one of the limitations that I've seen with it is that it just gets really repetitive. And because it's not producing anything new, it is constantly remixing. And so what you're coming up with is not anything novel. And that's what I've tried. I did a whole experiment with this current novel that I'm working on, to where I wrote the
Hmm.
first 21 chapters with AI. I was like, I just want to see what it's going to come out with. And they weren't good.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
chapters were repetitive. They were just boring. They just,
Yeah.
it doesn't connect. And you can attest to this because you write fiction, a lot of fiction as well. A lot of good fiction is the connective tissue. It's not just an interesting character or an interesting premise or an interesting scenario. It's how you put those things together in an interesting way that makes the story the story. Like once you take those things out, it's kind of like a a human with no bones. It just doesn't stand up. Yeah, it's a sack of skin, but it won't stand. And that's how
Right.
I've seen it when you rely on it. Now I will say it's getting a lot better, a lot faster now. It is to the point to where if you feed it, you've written. I just did this morning, to where if you write something like I wrote a whole chapter and the chapter came up too short. The chapter was like 220 words, and I was like, ah, you know, I'm fine with that short, but if it's like impactfully short, like intentionally short, I was like, this is just
Yes.
kind of emaciated. I want to put some meat on the bones, feed it some red beans and rice. So I was like, I took it to the AI and said, hey, I wrote this chapter. Give me some suggestions for how to fill it out, like what would based on what I wrote.
Hmm.
And it came back with like 15 different, very detailed suggestions. And I used ChatGPT for this. And I was like, okay, cool. So I wanted to test it further. And I said, okay, based on this suggestion, I picked one of them that I liked. And I said, expand this chapter based on what I already wrote. Because I wrote this and expand it using the same style how I wrote it. And it did it.
Hmm.
Now, this is a way that I know a lot of people when they think of using AI, and this is partially for you, but this is partially for listeners out there because there's a lot of people who think like this about AI, which I totally understand it. But part of this is okay, I'm taking something that I created and I'm expanding on it. This is a different type of use than saying, write me a book, write me this.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of those, and this is just an example of ways that you can use it to expand your thinking and then expand your writing. Um, I don't know.
So,
There's a lot of different ways to
so,
experiment.
so you're using it kind of as a beta reader?
Okay, so it's not really a beta reader because I have seen ways that you can say, okay, you're going to be this beta reader and then get feedback. I've also used it for editing, but this was more as like a co-writer, basically. Like
Mm.
if I gave it to you, an experienced novelist who's also in my genre, who also knows my style of writing, and this is where the AI does come in as a good tool because getting somebody who knows your style of writing, who is familiar with your genre, who's familiar with your story, that's going to take a long time. That's going to take a really good friend or a really good spouse. And I don't know about your wife, but my wife, she won't. I mean, she tries, she support, but it's just
Yeah,
getting her to sit down. Oh, let
yeah.
me tell you about this. It's hard. We got to have like a whole half a weekend for me to sit down and really get her into the process. So my point is having this as okay, it can just you just give it a little bit of context and then say this is my style. You feed it to it, and then I've got instant ideas for expansion of this chapter to flesh it out and make it more of the story that I already wrote. I feel like this
Hmm.
is a different type of use. And these are the type of uses because what happened was a lot of people heard the AI hype last year and then you know, they made an opinion, they tried it once and then they're like, oh, love it, hate it. But it's changed a lot in that time. So anyway, I want to get back to asking you questions. Um,
Well, I do want to kind of ask you,
sure.
don't you enjoy that part of the writing though, where you write something,
Yeah.
you know it's not good, you go back, you fail a few times, the process of figuring it out yourself. I
Yeah.
enjoy that because I had this discussion. I don't know if it was with you, but with someone about writer's block. I don't know
Yeah.
what writer's block is.
Yeah. Me
I don't
neither. Yeah.
experience that.
I'm in that
So
camp too. Yeah.
I may write something one day that I know is not very good when I write it, but I never sit there and look at a blinking cursor
Yeah.
and not know what to write. But
Yeah. Me
then
neither.
going back to figure out how to do the scene better, how to do the chapter better, for me is part of the thing.
Mm.
And I don't know if I want to give that over to a computer
Yeah.
program or algorithm or whatever AI is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I feel that. Yeah, and I think this is where we differ because and I think every writer is different about the process. I've always been a very not terrible editor, but I don't really like editing my work. I'm more of a first look, first kill kind of guy. I'll scribble out something and then I used to just be like, okay, that's good. I'm done with that. I don't do that as much anymore. I've kind of trained myself, whipped myself into, okay, you really should go back and look at what you write. And of course, I do it for final drafts and things like that. But I've gotten better about going back and looking. So actually, I have been doing this more. And this was just, I don't do this with every chapter, by the way. This was
Hmm.
just more, I
Right.
just did this
It was an
experiment.
experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, just
Right.
this experiment this morning. But normally, what I have been doing is because I've been, and you've been on my email list for the last few days, so you've seen that I'm writing and I'm releasing chapters of my current work to you guys on Wattpad. And so what I've been doing is I write it in Word and then I put it in Wattpad, and that gives enough of a contrast to where it looks new, it looks different, and then I would go back and exactly as you said, fill in the gaps, add new stuff, be like, okay, this needs, very much like a painter, that was the primer, and then now I'm adding the second layer. And that second
Right.
layer might lead to a third layer, which is a little bit more nuanced and detailed, but I'm getting closer to the final picture of it. And that's typically my process that I've been doing before this chapter. But
I see.
um, I typically don't enjoy that. I like what I like is the ideation phase. I like the raw. I've got this idea for this scene or for this character, and you know how it is. It's just each scene just kind of starts with like one seed, and then you water it, it starts growing, and I like that. Of let's just see what comes up. Let's see. I don't know how where your relationship with dialogue is, but man, I love writing dialogue. Dialogue has
Mhm.
always been one of my strengths. And so I will like, okay, I'll just start writing dialogue, I'll write some description, and then boom, the scene's done. And typically that's enough to give me a full scene. But
Mhm.
sometimes it's not.
Right.
So what about you? What's your when it comes to the process, what's your preferred? Is it dialogue or I mean, I feel like you're just from an outside in and then as an experienced writer, you're it's just so solid. And one of the things you do so well in When the Lantern Swings is I love it when an author is good at bringing in like these one-off characters and they give like a 1 or 2 line description that is just so like vivid. And I know you got this as a cop too, because that's one of the things that
Right.
we do. You go in, you interview somebody, and you see, oh, this person's short and shifty, and this, and you just kind of get a read really fast, and we
Mhm.
get good at that
Yeah.
as a cop. So, what's your preferred part of the writing process?
Uh, I enjoy doing dialogue not as much as I enjoy doing scene setting.
Mm,
That's my thing. Well, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? Um, but there's not really one aspect that I prefer over the other, because I like my dialogue. Oh, a long time ago, someone told me, write your dialogue and then um, read it out loud
mm,
without any description and see if people can tell if someone different is speaking.
yes.
Does it all sound like the same person or does it sound like something different?
Yeah.
Now, this is something that you have to fight with your editors about
Mm,
because
really?
some editors don't understand. First of all, they don't understand regional dialect.
Mm.
And when the lantern swings, initially Andy had a much stronger rural dialect.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And
I like Andy. He's
yeah,
he's cool.
and the editor said, "Well, he sounds like an idiot." I said, "No, he's not an idiot. This is just
It's how
where
people talk. Yeah.
this is just how people speak where he is from. And if you go to that area, this is how people are going to speak." And he's obviously a very bright person, a computer expert,
Yeah.
and all of this, college graduate. Um, but this is how he speaks, and they fought me on that, so I bent a little bit. But in my original iteration, it was a lot stronger, his
Mm.
rural dialect,
Mm.
and Ed has a more formal way of speaking.
Yeah, definitely.
Some of the other characters on the squad are a little less formal. They may speak in incomplete sentences, which people do in
All the
natural
time.
conversation.
Yeah.
That's another thing that you have to fight with your editors about. And this one
Mm.
I won because they would say, "Oh, they would want to change it to correct grammar." That's not how people speak.
Right.
People don't speak like they're sitting in an advanced English class.
Right.
They're comfortable with the people that they're with, so they speak in shorthand
Right.
because the other person knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Uh, so I won that fight completely. That's that's something in traditional publishing that
Yeah.
that I wasn't used to and not prepared for. This the things that you have to really fight for
Mm.
because they will try to if they had their druthers, the novel would be completely bland. All the
Wow.
characters would be generic, um, and
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
because a lot of people who are editors are people who are sent in the English language.
Mm.
And so they're thinking like an English teacher
Yeah.
rather than a reader
Right.
or a writer. Even though some of them are writers themselves,
Mm.
they're not thinking in that mode. So they're like, no, this is not grammatically correct. Yes, it's deliberately not grammatically correct.
Right.
Um, uh, so, but I just so that I will stick to my guns because
Yeah.
otherwise, my writing would be bland,
Yeah.
and to me, that's the greatest sin against your reader
Yeah.
is if you bore, just like an actor, if you bore
Absolutely.
your audience, that's the greatest sin.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And man, that's got to be so tough to just creatively, to have that. And that's actually one of the questions I had. This is a perfect transition to how do you how do you think about balancing commercial success with creativity? Because you've talked about this, partially to where, you've got to kind of appease these editors whose interests and goals are different from yours as the author. So how do you
Mhm.
think about that when you're writing original drafts and when you're getting a novel out?
I go on the advice of Dan Brown. Um, I have Masterclass, the program where experts in the field, come out and they sit on the couch and they talk about their field.
Mm.
My favorite one was Dan Brown, who talked about thrillers. He said, write the novel that you yourself would want to read,
Mm.
because chances are a lot of other people will want to read that same novel.
Right.
He said, if you start out trying to figure out what's going to be commercially successful, you're not going to have the passion
Right.
to complete it. But if you write that novel that say, hey, I wish that this story, like you've ever watched a movie and then you said, that's pretty good, but I wish they had done it like this. That would have
Mm.
been so much more exciting. What he's talking about. So write that novel that you yourself would want to read. And so
Right.
that's what I've tried to do
Yeah.
with When the Lantern Swings.
Yeah. And I think you have to start there because you're right. If you start trying to, and I think this is where a lot of media these days have gotten it wrong. They've dialed in a formula, and we see this a lot. And I can't speak for a lot of commercial fiction because I don't read a lot of commercial fiction, but for like shows and things like that, certain movies as well, there's definitely a formula that's been determined over the years, and you can tell when a movie is fitting into that formula, when a story's fitting into that formula, where the creativity, if it was there, it didn't make the final cut.
Yes.
And this just looks, sounds, and smells like a bunch of other movies that I've already seen. And that kind of squashing of creativity, that safeness, it's safeness at the end of the day. And that's what
Yes.
I was thinking when I asked you that question. Like, why do you think that is? And yeah, I think you're definitely right that part of it is they don't understand the perspective of a reader. But then I also think
Yeah.
is, well, it's safe. If you
Yes.
include somebody with a regional dialect and then somebody gets mad because, oh, well, we don't talk like that or whatever, like,
Yes.
whatever. And then now it's like, well, we told you to take that out because, and so this, this hedging of risk these days to avoid whatever lawsuit getting canceled whatever
Hmm.
is very high among, especially like the higher you get up, the more likely it seems like they will want you to conform to
Yes.
certain standards to where it's like, well, it's completely safe. We don't even have to worry about anything. But then it's also you've declawed it.
Yes.
You've kind of taken out the flavor of it, and now it tastes like everything else I've eaten today.
Hmm. Yeah. And in fact, I had what you just talked about. I had the trouble with the previous editor before going with the publishing house editor. I had my own editor, and they were very big on not offending anyone.
Yeah.
And so I have a line in When the Lantern Swings where Ed kind of makes fun of those novels that we talked about, where it's the kids in the dystopian world. He kind of makes fun of that,
Yeah.
but he praises the girl for being a reader in the age of shorthand information. But then he says, "Yeah, this novel is, one of those typical." And they said, "Oh, you, you can't put that in there. You you might turn off young young middle grade readers." And I said, "I can't worry about
Well,
offending
let him
every
go.
yeah little group,
Let him go then, and I mean,
Yeah,
and that's one of the things, it's like, okay, well, and this is something that I had to get over, and I don't know if you had to get over this as well when you were first starting, but your work's not for everybody. It shouldn't be.
yeah,
It should
yes,
not be. And you have to decide, more or less, you need to aim in a direction. You're not, whether you're aiming a laser or you're aiming a scatter shot shotgun, whatever, you decide, but it can't be 360. It's
right,
just not going to be. And I think this is what's
yeah,
happening with a lot of
yes,
media lately. They're trying to go 360. They want the
hmm
all general audiences. And
yes,
it's like, well, this isn't really for anybody then. It's certainly not for me.
exactly.
I saw a movie recently. If was that one? Have you? I don't know if you saw that one. It's a newer movie.
Ryan Reynolds, yes.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was pretty good, but I think it was one of those that it tried to appeal to a lot of different audiences,
Oh yeah.
and it was. I thought it was gonna be a kids movie because it's got that the character blue, that type of thing. So I
hmm
was like, oh, okay. And the main protagonist, she's a preteen girl, and I was
Yes.
like, okay, kids movie. But then it's like
hmm
this is kind of a drama too.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things to where okay, you're trying to appeal to both of these audiences, but then because you didn't pick one, it didn't appeal to anybody because
Yes.
I felt shortchanged as an older viewer, and I'm sure some kids
hmm
sitting through those dramatic scenes were like, sleep. They're like, I gotta go to the
Yes.
bathroom. So I think they see that a lot more these days. I want to get ready to wrap up. I want to get rid, respect your time. But um, last question I had was, what advice would you give to an aspiring fiction writer? Because as you know, this can be a very lonely field. As far as you spend most of your time working alone
Yes.
for several weeks, months, years, and then you hope somebody likes what you did 6 months ago or 7 months ago, if you can
hmm
even look that far ahead. Um, what advice would you give to somebody who's like, I want to do this? They're listening now. What would you say to them?
Uh, Two things. One, write. Don't ever say, "I've always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have time." If you're a writer, you're going to make time to write, and you're going to have trouble making time for other things. So writers write, and you may have to write like if you've got a lot of kids and a lot of responsibilities. Um, you might have to, okay, I'm going to fix the kids' lunch, and while they're eating the lunch in that half hour, I'm going to write something. But whatever it is, just sit down and write. Don't try to wait the perfect time to write because it will never come. Because if you're waiting for that time, it will never come. And then don't give up. All writers, myself, we talked about Dean Koontz, we talked about J.K. Rowling. You're going to get rejected. That is the nature of the field. And yes, it's personal. People who say that it's not personal, they're lying. When someone rejects your work, that's a gut punch because you put your heart and soul into it. But do not give up. Keep pushing because if you believe in your work, somebody else will believe in it too. That's the two things. Write, 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 and don't give up.
Yeah, that last part that you said is so important. You have to believe in your stuff way more than anybody else, and before anybody else will. If you Because I've met writers too, and I think I mentioned this a little bit when we first met a couple of weeks ago, that I met a couple of writers at the writing group here in town, and they were just, oh, well, what's your story about? Ah, well, it's just this little thing. You could just tell the way certain people talk about it that, okay, you're not giving me the Hollywood version. Like, if I was a movie producer sitting right here in front of you right now, you better give me the best you got. And you
Hmm.
can just tell the way they were coming off that they weren't confident in their story, or they felt like, like a lot of writers do, well, it's not perfect. Well, I'm not that good, whatever. It's like, no, no,
Yes.
your thing is the greatest thing. I mean, and you do have to, and you mentioned that. I love how you kind of mentioned it kind of casually in passing at the very beginning, but it's a little bit of arrogance, it's a little bit of confidence, it's a little bit of my shit don't stink because
There you go.
it
Yeah.
has to be that way because that's the only way that you're going to break through, or you're going to stick with it long enough that you're going to
Yeah.
believe in your characters and your story to where you can get somewhere with it, wherever you want to get, whether you want the film or you just want to see it in book form, you want to hold it.
Mhm.
The only way to get there is to believe in it long enough to let it get there. And yeah, I love that other thing you said. Writer's right.
Yeah.
So
That's
right.
it.
Don't don't make excuses like I know no
That's right.
time, whatever.
Mhm.
No, just do it.
Yeah. In my harsher moments, I'll tell them you're not a writer then. Because
Exactly.
if you're letting things stop you from writing, you're not a writer. A singer is going to sing. A painter is going to paint. You're going to write no matter what.
Right. Whether you got no money, whether you're eating cup noodles or whether you're eating
Yep.
fancy, I don't know. I can't think of a fancy. I don't really like food.
You don't like food.
I don't I don't like food, man. I don't like eating out. It made my wife so sore. She's like, "You're not eating enough." I'm like, "I'm not hungry." Well, thanks a lot, Alan. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on and us talking about this. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Hopefully, my questions weren't too crazy or too out there, but
Oh,
it, I really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, I look forward to just staying in touch with you, man. Like it's just very nice to meet you. I felt really honored to be like, okay, he wants to come on my show. Wow.
I'm here, and I was like, he wants to have me on the show. That's great. And no, there's I really enjoyed being here and doing your show, and maybe we'll have occasion to do it again.
For sure, and you could be one of those repeat guests, and we can kind of check in with each other and see how you're doing. If you're listening out there, thanks for checking out the Digital Novelist Podcast. I'm Keith Hayden. Don't forget to check out Alan Grimes, his latest novel, "When the Lantern Swings." It's an awesome, just supernatural police thriller, just really just tight, well done. Great job with it. I try and anytime I read a lot of indie fiction actually because
Mm.
I don't know. I just feel like I want to pay it forward and help other writers, especially you're more established, but especially writers who are just coming up because you
Right.
don't know if your stuff's good. Like you don't know if other people think your stuff is good. Even if you go with that, my shit don't stink attitude in, it's still great hearing it from somebody else that I read
Yes.
it and I liked it and here's what I liked about it. It's so rare.
Yes.
So make sure you check out my website. At the bottom of this video, you'll see a QR code that says scan here to start your novel. You can find the Digital Novelist Explorer on my website. I've got tools for you. I've got a 7-day email course. I've got all my other books on my website, keithhayden.net. And you've got all the other episodes of this podcast as well that you can check out. Make sure you subscribe to the Digital Novelist Podcast on Spotify or on YouTube, wherever you're listening to this. If this is on X, follow me on X. I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. Bye.
You, Keith.